Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today we are going to be talking about some NFL head coaching updates as we have finally closed all 8 of the head coaching vacancies that were opened up at the end of the season. So we will be ranking 1 through 8 my favorite hires of the offseason cycle. Then we're going to be moving on to the Dallas Cowboys as owner Jerry Jones at the Senior Bowl told reporters that the Cowboys are all in for the upcoming season. So we'll be touching on what that means, what it looks like for the Cowboys in the coming months. And then in the latter half of the show, we're going to be shifting to some basketball. First with Kevin Durant and Damian Lillard's returns to their former homes as Durant and the Suns went to Brooklyn last night and Lillard's Bucks went back to Portland. So we'll be touching on both of those games, some different results in those two games, and then finally we're going to be ending off the show with some college basketball as we enter the final full month of regular season college basketball. So a lot to get into today. Before we get started, just a reminder to like and follow, and for any of our live viewers to use the link that is on the bottom ticker, that is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. And remember to leave a comment so we can make this show as interactive as possible. So without further ado, getting into our first topic here, I wanted to rank the NFL head coach hirings, as just this morning we got news that the Washington Commanders have decided to sign Dan Quinn to be their next head coach. Now, we're actually going to be starting with Dan Quinn here. I do want to just get out ahead of this and say I don't think that any of these were bad hires. I think that this Dan Quinn hire for the Commanders and why I have him at the bottom of the list is I just find it meh. I don't think that it really pushes the needle all too much, and I think that it's a little interesting the fact that they decided to go with this defensive oriented head coach as they have the number 2 pick in the draft. They have to evaluate which of the prospects they're going to take. Yes, there's an outside shot that maybe they would want to trade up for Caleb Williams, but I would imagine they're going to stay put at 2 and either go with Drake May or Jaden Daniels. So a little bit of an interesting decision to go with the defensive route there, and we do still have some time before the NFL draft, but it just takes a little bit longer in this process now to build up your offensive staff, and there's a lot of evaluation that goes into this. Again, plenty of time, but I just thought it was a little bit curious. Now, Dan Quinn, yes, he spent the past couple seasons with the Cowboys, and this past season specifically, it was the defense that let them down once they reached the playoffs, letting the Packers just run all over them. Jordan Love looked as good as he has all season against them, and they talked about it on the broadcast. Definitely an interesting defensive strategy, going with more laid-back zone coverage as opposed to the heavy man coverage that they ran throughout the year. And as a result, the Packers just sort of ran away with the game there. Now, Dan Quinn's not a bad candidate. He has head coaching experience before. He was previously with the Atlanta Falcons and sort of a mediocre tenure there. He finished his career there 43-42 as a head coach, but he did lead them to a couple playoff appearances, including a Super Bowl appearance, and not necessarily the best result there. The 28-3 game, the largest blown lead in Super Bowl history, but he got there in the first place, so there should be some level of credit there. Was with the Seahawks as a defensive coordinator for their championship even a few years before that. So he's been in the big moment a couple times, and I think that it's a very middling hire. I feel like they could have gone in a better direction, but I don't think that they got a bad coach. I think that he's an upgrade over Ron Rivera, there was definitely a change that needed to be made. So that is where I stand on Dan Quinn. I have him 8th in my rankings. Number 7, I have Brian Callahan, hired to the to the Tennessee Titans as their head coach, was previously the offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals. I thought that he was there for a few years and he did a pretty good job. Obviously, when you have Joe Burrow, who's one of the best quarterbacks in the league, that definitely helps, but Callahan at least deserves some credit for helping Joe Burrow flawlessly I know that he had an injury in his first season, so I wouldn't say it was fully flawless, but mentally, from a playing perspective alone, I thought that Joe Burrow was ready from day one, and Callahan deserves some credit there. I thought that the work that he did with Joe Mixon, who had a little bit of a stagnant start, an inconsistent start to his career, really helped turn that run game around, and they developed a very strong offense on the side of the ball while he was there. Now, a little bit of a younger candidate as well, and again, I think that he just has a lot to prove. He was in a pretty good system there in Cincinnati with a lot of good players. So now he goes to Tennessee, where the quarterback isn't a surefire thing. Obviously, they bring him in to hope that they can help Will Levis develop, or if there's any outside shot that Malik Willis could be the quarterback of the future, then maybe him. They've taken both of these quarterbacks with day 2 picks over the past couple years, so hopefully they're imagining that one of these guys emerges as their quarterback of the future. Receiver is significantly worse than what they had going on in Cincinnati, and the offensive line definitely has its holes as well. So Callahan has a lot of obstacles in his way necessarily to run quite as efficient of an offense as he was running in Cincinnati. But again, don't think it's a bad hiring. I'm just not super moved by it, and we could come back and things could be different, but he's got a lot to prove to start off his job. Number 6, I have Antonio Pierce. I'm a big Antonio Pierce fan. He seems extremely personable. You can just tell by the way that the locker room and the team responded to him over the last few months that he was the head coach, that he's somebody that I think the Raiders did need at this moment. They have been in a little bit of turmoil in terms of their head coaches. They had Gruden a couple years ago, who was removed after the scandals sort of popped up with the emails, and at that time it was Rich Bisaccia that stepped in and took over for Gruden. That team actually ended up being pretty solid. Bisaccia led them to a 7-5 record and a playoff appearance. Now that team, it had a playoff caliber roster, but to go through that sort of mid-season change and to still end up in a decent position, I think that Bisaccia deserves credit for that. And there was talks at the time about bringing him back, but they end up going with the big splash name hire, Josh McDaniels. And that ultimately fizzles out this year. Never really looked great. And once Antonio Pierce steps in, the Raiders start winning games, and the team is smoking cigars in the locker room, and they just feel more free. A lot of people sort of want to make it a negative connotation that they were so happy to be this middling team, but they were in a really bad place, I think, mentally, that locker room was for the beginning of the season, and they turned themselves around. Max Crosby, their star defensive end, was openly advocating they need to bring back Antonio Pierce, and that's what they do. I think that it's the right decision. I did want to go back and sort of look at some of the history of interim coaches end up getting the head coaching jobs, and overall over the past decade it hasn't been all too successful. You have Doug Marrone, who took over for the Jaguars in 2016 after Gus Bradley was fired. He held the job through 2020. Mike Mularkey took over in Tennessee, and despite making the playoffs in his second year after being named the full-time head coach, the Titans decided to fire him. Romeo Crennel was the interim coach in 2011, and he was given the reins as the head coach and then immediately was fired after the next season after the Chiefs went 2-14. So the majority of these examples didn't pan out, but the most notable one was the Dallas Cowboys, where Jason Garrett stepped in as the interim head coach in 2010 after Wade Phillips was fired, and then he obviously held his job through the 2019 season. And I know that Garrett's tenure there in Dallas was a little polarizing for a lot of fans, but he stuck there and he stuck around. Jerry Jones had faith in him. You can say that's a Jerry Jones thing, but that's the most prominent example we have of interim coaches becoming full-time head coaches with that same franchise. It has not had a great track record, but hoping that Antonio Pierce can buck that trend. Number 5, I have Gerard Mayo to the Patriots. The Patriots had a succession plan in place to have him take over once Bill Belichick was out in New England, and that's how this came about. So it was a pretty flawless transaction for the most part. The players seem to be on board with it. Kraft seems stoked to have Mayo on board, a former player that played linebacker for them, won Super Bowls with them. So it was clear that Kraft was high on Mayo last offseason when Mayo was receiving some head coaching interviews, and Kraft wanted to make sure that Mayo would stick with them. So he put in this succession plan for him to take over afterwards. And, you know, for the most part, it was a very easy decision. There was a little bit of speculation once Mike Vrabel was available as a head coach that maybe he could take over, but it is Mayo, and I think that ultimately this is a good decision. He's bringing in a whole new staff. The defensive coordinator and special teams coordinator positions are already in place. They still have to find their offensive coordinator after Bill O'Brien left for Ohio State. So we'll still see how they build up this coaching staff in this roster. The Patriots have a lot of work to do. My number 4 hire that I have is Mike Macdonald. Admittedly, this might be a little low. Macdonald now comes in to the NFL as the youngest head coach in the league at just 36 years old. But as we touched on yesterday on the show, he is very accomplished already. He has developed a very strong reputation through his years with the Baltimore Ravens and his brief stint as the defensive coordinator for the Michigan Wolverines. He now comes into a situation in Seattle where really what's been holding them back some, I know that the offense hasn't been perfect for them either necessarily, but they are in a division with tons of offensive-minded guys in Shanahan and McVay, and now he steps in with a defense that has a good amount of young talent and mixed in with some veteran presence. That's sort of the similar situation to what happened with the Ravens, where he got the most out of his young guys and really rejuvenated some of these veterans such as Jadeveon Clowney and Kyle Van Noy to play some of their best football of their career. Now he ends up in Seattle, gets a 6-year deal. I think that's a good hire. I have him at 4. I feel like there's a strong chance I could end up regretting having him that low. Number 3, I have Jim Harbaugh. I know that this is obviously the flashiest pick, but I think that there are maybe some long-term concerns here. Now, I think that from day one, it's going to be a spark plug that the Chargers need to sort of get themselves in shape here after sort of feeling lost this year. Obviously, Justin Herbert goes down with an injury for the second half of the year, and they were sort of automatically out of contention then. But the season seemed over even before then. So now Harbaugh can come in, and he can help maximize the potential of Justin Herbert, ideally, build up a run game that has been miserable for them, and they have an aging roster. So it's going to take a little bit of overhaul in terms of contracts and roster-wise, but I think that he has a reputation of building up really good coaching staffs and having his players buying into his system. So I think that they can turn this around relatively quick within the next couple years, at least to be a competent, competitive playoff team. My question is how this is going to play out long term. He has also sort of had a reputation of wearing out some of his superiors in his previous jobs despite having the success. This happened in San Francisco. Michigan, he obviously left on his own terms, and he was even offered a gigantic contract to stay, but there was seemingly a little bit of conflict based off of some reports. So long term, I'm not sure. I do think that this is very much what the Chargers need as of today, though, to get this thing back on the right track. Number 2, I have Dave Canales. Now, this is the one where I'm very bought in on Dave Canales. I think that he is a very great offensive mind, and I think that specifically his ability to sort of communicate with quarterbacks is exactly what the Carolina Panthers need, coming off of a disastrous season where they trade up for the number 1 pick to select Bryce Young. And Bryce Young has a pretty bad season. Obviously, the circumstances around him are not good by any means, but it doesn't help that the number 2 pick, CJ Stroud, puts together an unbelievable amount of success for a rookie. And the Panthers are here this year now without their own first-round pick and sort of in a stalemate. So I think bringing in Canales to try and help rejuvenate the offense is a great move. Canales was previously with the Buccaneers as their offensive coordinator and the Seattle Seahawks as their quarterback coach, helping rejuvenate both Geno and Baker to really high levels considering where they were at previously. Now, this has been a very fast rise for Canales, so I do maybe struggle a little bit with the fact that is he getting into this maybe a little sooner than he should be. He's 42 years old, so he's not young by any means, but he's also not super experienced. This is a tough Carolina job under David Tepper, who has sort of tarnished his name a little bit with some of his owner decisions, but it sounds like he's taking a little bit more of a hands-off approach this season, leaving more to the new GM and to Canales, so we will see how that plays out. And then my number 1 hire, I have Raheem Morris. I'm a big fan of Raheem Morris. I think that he has all of the valuable experience you could want from a head coach. He has championship experience with a couple different teams. He worked on the defensive side of the ball with the Rams as the defensive coordinator for their Super Bowl win a couple years ago, but he was at least also there present for this McVay offense, so not that he's going to necessarily be overly involved on the offensive side of the ball, but has seen a system that has worked and has taken them to the highest levels for a Super Bowl. I thought that the Rams were the most overachieving team in the NFL this season, and a lot of that had to do with how much Morris was able to get out of this defense considering the circumstances in order to put themselves in the position for the Super Bowl in 2021. They really had to jeopardize a lot of their future with cap space, with draft capital, and after a bad season last year, they were able to bounce back this year with a lot of young players starting for them on both sides of the ball. Defensively, they had the likes of Jordan Fuller, Byron Young, Michael Hoyt, Russ Yeast, Kobe Durant. These were all guys that either weren't here for their Super Bowl or were on the roster and weren't getting playing time. And it's not like they were an outstanding unit as a defense, but they were good enough to get the job done and help them to a wild card spot. And I think that this is a very good hire for the Atlanta Falcons. Morris was obviously with the Rams. He was with the Falcons when they made their Super Bowl in 2017. He was actually on the coaching staff in a very minimal role, but he was there present for the Buccaneers Super Bowl win in 2004. So has a lot of experience. I think that this is a very good hire for them. So that's all the time we have for on this segment alone. stick with us, because after the break, on the note of the Cowboys needing to make a change at defensive coordinator now that Dan Quinn is gone, Jerry Jones has some thoughts on the upcoming season for them. So we will be getting to the Cowboys on the other side of the break. Stick with us.